Hi, this is Matt Rochelle Sr., Cal Baptist University. This is my Cat 2 assignment, Fate of Lactate. Before we get into everything, I want to go over something that I feel is important, lactate versus lactic acid. Commonly thought as of the same, but they are not. Lactate is actually a byproduct of lactic acid when lactic acid releases a hydrogen ion after being formed in anaerobic glycolysis. So lactate will come from lactic acid. Lactate accumulation. During light to moderate exercise with sufficient oxygen, blood lactate is removed at the same pace that it is produced, so it doesn't really accumulate. As intensities increase, though, lactate removal can lag behind or not keep pace with its production, and this is where we get the difference between slow glycolysis and fast glycolysis. Down here, we have the Krebs cycle, which we talked about in our first cap, and we had our presentation on that, and that deals with slow glycolysis, like I said. And then what we're going to talk about today and spend most of our time on is the Cori cycle, and this is anaerobic in nature and fast glycolysis. It deals with the liver and the skeletal muscles. Lactate accumulation continued. Basically, what happens is NADH is produced and exceeds the muscle cell's capacity for shuttling hydrogens down the respiratory chain because of the lack of oxygen supply. So as intensity increases with exercise, we're breathing in oxygen, but it's just not keeping pace with the demand for the metabolism. So excess hydrogens are accepted by pyruvate, and this is where lactic acid is being formed instead of the acetyl-CoA, like in our slow glycolysis or aerobic glycolysis. When the lactic acid is formed, it has to go through one more step, and that is the formation of lactate in the body, and we do that by lactate dehydrogenase. Okay. Trained individuals will take longer to have lactate buildup or hit their lactate threshold than untrained individuals. Typically, in an untrained individual, they will hit their lactate threshold or have lactate buildup at about 55% of their max aerobic capacity. Now, here we go with the Cori cycle. Let me just slide this down a little bit. Okay. So, like I said earlier in our my first cap, and I tell my students, being a PE teacher or health and PE teacher, I tell them all the time that the body is an incredible machine. So a lot of times people think of lactate as a waste product, but in actuality it isn't. It's going to be recycled through the liver and through gluconeogenesis, which I'll talk about in a second, and it'll basically, the liver will provide glucose to go back to the muscles. So let's start over in the muscle. So we have a skeletal muscle excuse me. We have a skeletal muscle over here, and we have glucose. Glucose is basically what we need to break down to form the ATP, which we talked about in the first cap. And the beginning of it is glycolysis. But instead of being in that slow glycolysis where it's more aerobic in nature and we go through the Krebs cycle, we are going through anaerobic type intensities, and the glucose, when it gets to pyruvate, pyruvate joins with two hydrogens and lactate is formed. So lactate is basically our end product to get some ATP, and it'll leave the skeletal muscle and go into the bloodstream, and it'll travel to the liver. The great thing about lactate is that we can recycle it, and it's basically going to go through the opposite process that we just had in the skeletal muscle, and the lactate will lose its hydrogens, and pyruvate and NADH will be left over, which will form some more ATP, and from pyruvate we'll get glucose through, like I said, gluconeogenesis. The glucose will then leave the liver and travel back to the muscle, and it will just constantly repeat itself. Consequences, just move myself back over here so we can see everything. Consequences of lactate accumulation. Basically, when lactate accumulates at a significant level, we have discomfort and fatigue that sets in on the athlete. Some reasons that this happens, the pH decreases as lactic acid increases. So the pH in the intramuscular cell is going to decrease, and that's where we're going to have some discomfort, and it will ultimately impair exercise performance. In another study that I did research on, it showed that intracellular pH could have more of an indirect effect on exercise performance, and the actual temperature dependence of the pH affects the force of the contracting muscle more. So it might not necessarily be the actual pH number, but it's the temperature dependence of that pH that will affect how quickly a muscle can contract, or with how much force a muscle can contract. But essentially, when it all comes down to it, as lactate is produced, or production is increased, and the body's oxygen utilization decreases, fatigue will take over the athlete. Fast twitch versus slow twitch fibers. Lactate threshold can be determined by the type of exercise that we're doing, or by the athlete's genetic makeup. Someone with more slow twitch fibers will have a higher oxidative capacity of lactate, which means that the lactate will be able to, as it's being produced, will also be able to be taken away, basically in an equilibrium, and they'll be able to stay at that steady pace for a longer time. While someone with more fast twitch fibers, which is more powerful, explosive athlete, will favor more of the glycolytic energy production, which we were talking about with the anaerobic process. We found that a percent of slow twitch fibers are related to both the absolute and relative lactate thresholds, and this would suggest that the ratio of slow twitch to fast twitch fibers may exert a genetic influence over lactate threshold and possibly control the range in which the relative lactate threshold can shift. So basically what this means is that genetics can play a huge part in the type of athlete you are. Determining your genetic makeup, or depending on your genetic makeup, if you have more slow twitch fibers, you're going to be more inclined to do fitness or activities that are with slow glycolysis and utilize the Krebs cycle. And if you're a fast twitch type of athlete that has more explosiveness, you might be using the fast glycolysis or anaerobic systems better. And here are my references. Look to hearing back from you. Have a good day.